Good evening and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host, Nancy Miller, and if you are listening to this podcast, you likely care about two things: good true crime and a good night's sleep. And you found, like I have, that they're two great things that can go great together if done in the right way. And that's the ambition of Dead Sleep. The very best of both of those worlds. High quality, true crime storytelling. Real life mysteries told mindfully to help fatigue your mind, to aid in your relaxation and fall asleep. That's the way this show is designed. Through the style of story, the music, and most important, no ads. You really can fall asleep without that anxiety, that anticipation of this ad that's going to barge in like the Kool-Aid man and wake you up, or force you to get a subscription to make those terrible ads go away. That's not going to happen. In exchange, you listen. And if you find that you enjoy listening and it helps you fall asleep, and you listen more than once, in a lot of cases, people listen to these episodes 4 times, become a paid subscriber. I think that is the ultimate gesture of respect and reciprocity. Subscribe through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. When you support the show, you get a free subscriber-only episode every month, and peace of mind, I guess, that this show will continue. Thanks to your support. So with that, let's settle in for the night. Close our eyes. And think about, for one moment, before we drift off, what it is that keeps you up at night. For a lot of us, insomnia is driven by a blanket term. Call it anxiety. Anxiety is kind of the catch-all term, but from an anecdotal point of view, I suspect that a lot of us stay awake at night doing something called rumination. Rumination is thinking and thinking and thinking about something over and over again. And that word, ruminate, it first started with animals. Goats, sheep, cattle. These animals all have a second stomach called a rumen. And so they're known as ruminants. And those are animals that eat grass, swallow the grass, regurgitate the grass, and chew it again. Now, think about that with your mind. You've got a thought, you try and swallow the thought, and it keeps coming back, and you can't stop thinking about it. And rumination is more than overthinking. There's a quality to rumination that's rueful, something you regret. If comedy is tragedy plus time, ruminating is cringe plus time. It's almost always something from the past that can haunt you, and you can't seem to let it go. What would happen if all of those grievances, all of those memories from the past were virtually wiped away? Would we worry less? Would we sleep better if we didn't have all those things on our minds? Which brings us to tonight's episode, which is about a phenomenon. A story that's one part psychological thriller and another part medical mystery. As always, there is no graphic violence in Dead Sleep, but this episode does mention suicide. So be aware while listening. Christmas time was always Kim DeNicola's favorite time of year. One of the best Christmases she ever had was in December of 1979. She was 17 years old, and their tree that year was one of those super 70s fake trees. It wasn't even green. It was silver, layered with tinsel and covered in family Christmas ornaments, vintage and homemade, family heirlooms of sentimental value, but priceless to Kim. Because that Christmas in 1979 would be the last one she'd ever remember. Because that following year, 1980, something would happen to Kim. A tragic and mysterious series of events she'd never forget. Kim woke up in a hospital in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And just about the last place she wanted to be was in a hospital. Outside those walls, the whole world awaited her. Kim grew up in Baton Rouge and was a senior in high school. She was just about to turn 18. On the verge of graduation, she had just taken one of her final exams, and these next several weeks were crucial in ensuring she would get to walk come graduation day. But now here she was, alone in a hospital, wondering what had happened to her. She didn't appear to have any broken bones, and she wasn't on any machines. The only person in the room with her, she realized, was a nurse. And she opened her eyes and saw the nurse putting an IV into her arm. Noticing that Kim was alert, the nurse asked her a couple of questions. Did she know what year it was? Yes, Kim replied, it's 1980. Then the nurse asked, and who is the President of the United States? Kim replied, Ronald Reagan. When she said that, Kim noticed the nurse stopped, then abruptly left the room. And this time, when she returned, she brought the doctor back with her. The doctor asked her the same questions. And again, she gave the same answers. What year was it? 1980. Who was the president? Ronald Reagan. And it was then, when Kim saw the doctor's face, that she knew something was wrong. She had no idea what. But Kim was a teenage girl with more urgent matters on her mind. She had final exams. So she needed to get out of the hospital as soon as possible, because if she missed those exams, she might not graduate. And who knew what could happen? The doctor appeared to pause, and Kim waited for him to say something. But before he could explain what was happening, a bespectacled old man walked in. He was maybe in his late 50s, early 60s, which, in the mind of a teenager, is practically ancient. The man rushed up to Kim and grabbed her hand. He was so grateful she was okay. He was so worried. Kim stared at the middle-aged man's face, his glasses, his bald head, frightened and taken aback. Now it was Kim who had the questions. Questions along the lines of, who was this odd old man? And, just as important, where were Kim's parents? How do you break it to a 17-year-old teenager that things aren't what they seem? How do you tell a beautiful young girl who thinks she has her whole life ahead of her that her life, actually, as she knew it, was over? Kim found out soon enough. When this strange man, who was easily 40 years older than she was, told her something she couldn't believe. It wasn't possible. But he swore it was true. They were married. He was her husband. Kim looked at the man and shook her head. This was ridiculous. There was no way this was her husband. Kim was 17 years old. In pictures taken around that time, you can see just how young she was. And she had the wholesome look of a sweet-faced teenager with dewy skin and shiny brown shoulder-length hair and sparkling brown eyes full of anticipation of a life that was in store. So obviously what this man was saying was impossible. She wasn't married to this old guy or anybody else. But this man kept insisting she was his wife, that they'd been married for 10 years. And not only that, she was a mother, with 2 biological sons and stepkids. Oh, when she was also a grandmother. This was ridiculous, and Kim knew it. Here were the facts. The year is 1980, and I'm 17, and I'm about to finish high school. So they really needed to let her go to make sure that she could graduate. Right, so the good news was Kim didn't need to worry about graduating from high school because she'd already graduated and had her diploma. The bad news was she graduated almost 40 years ago. You see, it wasn't actually the spring of 1980 like Kim thought. In fact, it was the fall of 2018. A mirror would reveal to Kim the brutal truth. She was not 17. She was 56 years old. Her once shiny brown hair now had white-gray streaks in it, as bold and shocking to Kim as bolts of lightning. To even see herself in the mirror, her middle-aged eyes needed glasses. She'd learned that she'd gotten married twice, that she'd raised a total of 7 children, kids she couldn't remember. And the parents she did remember, that Christmas with the tree a few months earlier in December of 1979, they'd long passed away. Kim burst into tears. This wasn't happening. How could this be happening? How could she feel inside, know for certain in her own mind that she was 17 years old? She was about to graduate from high school. It was 1980. But the reality in front of her said otherwise. That she was a middle-aged woman, a grandmother, and that a whole life had passed her by, and she couldn't remember any of it. What was she supposed to do now? The doctor promised they'd take more tests. They'd get to the bottom of this mystery and figure out what was wrong with Kim. How had she lost all of those years? And how could she get them back? Kim's husband, at least the man who claimed to be her husband, tried to help Kim retrace her steps by sharing what he remembered. Maybe if they could bring themselves back to the night of the incident, it might explain something. Maybe identify the cause for this memory loss, and then figure out that treatment. In Kim's version of events, it was the spring of 1980. She was about to turn 18 and graduate from high school. She was preparing for final exams. But in Kim's husband's timeline, which was the real-life timeline to everyone but Kim, it wasn't the spring of 1980. It was October 2018. The way he remembered it, his wife, Kim, had called him, and she was in a panic. She was on her way to Bible study when she was experiencing a terrible headache, a migraine probably, and her vision was getting blurry. Her husband remembers telling her to go to the ER. Somewhere along the way between having that migraine and the ER visit where the nurse put in the IV, somewhere within those hours, Kim's mind deleted 39 years. And it was a deletion because it wasn't that her whole memory was gone. She knew her name, she knew who she was, she remembered her family up until the age of 17. And then it just stopped, like a clock. Her brain hit pause. And for whatever reason, her brain wanted to keep Kim forever young, forever 17. On the one hand, it's like that movie Cocoon. Who wouldn't want to feel young again? But unlike the movies, Kim's life was complicated. Her mind was stuck in the 80s, but everything else was in the here and now. Doctors performed every type of scan, MRI, CT scan, any type of imaging that might reveal what was wrong with her. Sometimes a brain tumor, it can be the size of a sunflower seed, and yet, if positioned in the active part of a brain, could potentially wreak havoc. But test after test, everything came up clear. She didn't have early dementia, she didn't have Alzheimer's, she didn't have a brain tumor, and she hadn't had a stroke. So the doctors reached a conclusion that Kim had transient global amnesia. Transient global amnesia, TGA, is a temporary condition of often short-term memory loss and sometimes difficulty in recalling older memories. And migraines are believed to be a possible trigger for TGA. The doctors sent Kim home. There wasn't much they could do for her at the hospital, as there was no medical treatment for TGA. Typically, an episode of transient global amnesia lasts a few hours. Hopefully, once she got home, she'd get her memory back. At home with her husband, side by side, they flipped through family albums. It included a picture of her 10 years earlier, on her wedding day with her current husband. As she stared at the photo, of a woman in her mid-40s in a white dress, it was like looking at a stranger, a totally different person. That wasn't Kim. And this wasn't her life. Maybe, hopefully, she just needed time. So Kim went home. With any luck, this would all pass. Just a little neurological storm. A few hours of dark clouds and thunder rumbling in the brain. And maybe that's what her brain needed. She could close her eyes, go to sleep, and let that brain storm wash away whatever was clogging her mind. Clear the gutters. And then maybe when she woke up come morning, her brain would be bright and clean and clear again. She'd wake up in a world where she recognized her children, recognized her husband, and felt love for them. So you hope that feeling would come back. Because at that moment in time, she felt nothing. Not exactly nothing. She felt a profound existential sadness and despair. She'd gone to bed, a teenager with her whole life ahead of her, and woken up a woman in her 50s. Where did all those years go? How could all those memories just disappear? Just give it time, they said. Give it time, and your memory will bounce back. Yet time, for someone with transient global amnesia, it's like a melting clock. A feeling best reflected in that famous Salvador Dali painting, the surrealist masterpiece he painted back in 1931. A lot of us know that painting as Melting Clocks, but the actual title of that famous masterpiece is called The Persistence of Memory. And one interpretation of the painting's surrealist imagery of those 3 pocket watches melting in the heat was that this painting conveyed the elasticity of our temporal experiences. That time is fluid. Salvador Dali himself compared those melting clocks to a wheel of cheese, in that he saw time as a melting camembert, which sounds kind of delicious, unless that camembert is your brain, and that heat is liquefying your memories, obliterating who you thought you were. If you haven't seen that painting in a long time, you might forget one key detail. That in Dali's painting, there's a face. That face has its eyes closed, eyelashes, and resting on that face, or maybe smothering it, is a melting clock. A symbol of human surrender, an acceptance that our mind, our memories, and time itself move in ways we can't control. Now, transient global amnesia is described as temporary and harmless. It's described as benign. But to the people who have experienced TGA, it's something dangerous and terrifying. You feel like that figure pinned under that melting clock. That condition, transient global amnesia, it can trap anyone at any time, no matter who you are, turning ordinary life into a nightmare. This past April 2024, that nightmare happened, live and on stage, to an actor named Lev Schreiber. Lev Schreiber is a famous actor, a seasoned professional who's been acting in movies and TV since the 1990s. But it was the theater, live on stage in front of an audience, where Lev really shined. He'd won a Tony in 2005 for his role in David Mamet's Glengarry Glen Ross. Obviously, he was a consummate pro. Until this one performance night. This past spring, in a Broadway production of a play called Doubt. Lev had been on stage thousands of times in his life, but this time was like no other. And it started in his dressing room. Lev was getting ready to go on stage when he was suddenly overcome by a terrible headache. At first, he thought it was something maybe he'd eaten. He'd had fast food earlier and wondered if something in that food, an additive or preservative, might have been the cause. He figured it would pass. And anyway, it was showtime. He didn't have time to dwell on the matter. But as he walked down the stairs from his dressing room to the stage, something shifted. He felt strange. He saw a woman. He recognized her sort of, but couldn't remember her name. Wasn't sure who she was. Didn't have a clue that that woman was the actress Amy Ryan, who was the co-lead in the play. He managed to make his way to the actual stage. Once there, he said he felt like he was in a dream, or nightmare, where he knew he was in the play, but he didn't know which play this was, or who anyone else was on stage. He couldn't remember any of his lines. It all vanished. And the actor stood on stage, mind blank, disoriented and terrified, for several minutes. Ultimately, he left the stage. The production was briefly paused and his understudy stepped in for that performance. Lev worried he'd had a stroke. But just like Kim in Baton Rouge, his scans came back completely clear. The doctor told him he had TGA, this strange form of amnesia. It was rare, but it would pass. And there was nothing they could really do for him at the hospital. Just go home, get some rest, and when you wake up, hopefully it'll all be over. While in the throes of TGA, Lev worried that his career, that his life was over. As an actor, his memory was everything. Memorizing lines, yes, but also using memory to create characters. Memories form experience. Experience is how we develop expertise. Expertise leads to wisdom. All of that was potentially gone. At the time, Lev couldn't believe that it could possibly be that he'd be better within a matter of hours. So he was surprised when, within 24 hours, his memory did return. But since that experience, he's described in interviews that he's not quite the same. And maybe never will be. The day that it happened, he felt embarrassed because You can't see TGA on a scan. So he worried that people thought he was faking it to get out of a performance. In an interview he did with Seth Meyers, he said it was terrifying. And once you experience TGA, you live in fear that it'll happen again. Though according to medical experts, TGA typically only happens once to a person. But who it happens to and why? Like Kim, Lev Schreiber was also 56 years old when this incident happened. And just before his mind went black, he too experienced a severe migraine headache. And like Kim, he'd had migraines before. The question was, what made this time different? An important clue could be found on a whole different stage, on tour with Taylor Swift. When a young French student bought tickets to see Taylor Swift in Paris, she expected the concert of a lifetime. She'd bought the tickets to the Eras Tour a year in advance. The day finally came on May 9th, 2024. And the French superfan went to the show, and she had an amazing time. Or at least, she hoped she did. Hours after the concert, she couldn't remember any of it. Not the costumes, or the performance, or Taylor's onstage presence. She remembered every detail of making her way back to her hotel after the concert, but not the show itself. This French student was 22 years old and was an outlier. One among a small percentage of fans who reported this strange and almost cruel memory loss. The very thing that these young women were most excited for was the thing they couldn't remember. And this phenomena that was happening among Taylor Swift fans was gaining enough traction that a medical researcher decided to investigate. A theory of what had happened and what had caused this memory loss among a group of girls in different parts of the world. There might be a connection between heightened anticipation, in this case, the year-long wait for the tickets, elevated stress hormones, which of course happens when we go to a concert or encounter large crowds, along with the sensory overload of a concert, plus spikes of adrenaline. The result is potentially like a power surge, one that blows a fuse in the brain. But most of these girls, their memory loss, it didn't affect their lives. And they really only felt it in retrospect. But there was a famous case, years before Kim's case, of TGA that took over a man's life. A story as vexing as it is mystifying. It was roughly 10 years ago, February 2013, when a man was found in a cheap motel just outside of Palm Springs. He was found unconscious. He was taken to the hospital. And once at the hospital, they found his ID. And his ID said his name was Michael Thomas Boatwright. That he was a Vietnam War vet, and that he was originally from Florida. Those were the facts on paper. But when this patient awoke in the hospital, and they tried to speak with him and ask him what happened, they couldn't understand a word he said, because he apparently could only speak Swedish. Somehow, they figured out that he was trying to say that his name wasn't Michael Boatwright. He wasn't from Florida. His name was Yona E, and he was from Sweden. He evidently only spoke Swedish, did not understand English. Eventually, this all was translated for them from a Swedish interpreter. So what was the hospital to do? The man wasn't physically injured, but after a series of tests, there was nothing wrong with his brain. It was determined that he had transient global amnesia, TGA. So the hospital had to be careful with what they did. Because here they had a man with no money, no home, no memory, who couldn't understand English. They couldn't just let him go out into the world on his own. So they let him stay at the hospital until his memory came back. They assumed, as with most TGA sufferers, that his memory would come back. It was just a matter of time. 24 hours, 48 hours, that's usually the maximum. But in this case, it didn't work out that way. Michael Boatwright, Yona, lived at that hospital for 5 months. Day after day after day, he tried to regain his memory, but nothing. Communication between him and the staff was, of course, limited because of his Swedish and not understanding any English. His lack of progress led some at the hospital to wonder if he was faking it, malingering so he had a place to live with essentially free meals, even if it was a hospital. Time and time again, they tried to dupe him into speaking English, but it never worked. He was, at least in his own mind, a Swedish man named Yona E. And until further notice, he was at the hospital to stay. Yona was assigned a social worker, and a reporter at a newspaper called The Desert Sun picked up the story. The social worker tried to track down family members, while the reporter at the newspaper tried to figure out the bigger what happened. Through their shared efforts, they were able to locate Boatwright's sister, who was American, not Swedish, and lived in Louisiana. Michelle, his sister, said that she hadn't seen Michael in 10 years. And she had lost touch with him for so long, he maybe wouldn't even remember her. It was possible he wouldn't recognize her, especially if he couldn't speak English. They found a longtime friend who explained that he knew Michael Boatwright. He knew him as Michael Boatwright, not Yona. And that up until recently, Michael had lived in China, not Sweden. But his life in China was largely wonderful. He'd made a good living, teaching English and playing tennis. Then something happened in January of 2013. That was a month before he was found in Palm Springs. In early 2013, according to this friend, he'd attempted to take his own life, mixing vodka with animal tranquilizers. It was then that this friend told the reporter that he realized that his friend Michael had fallen on hard times. His ex-wife had remarried, and his work visa to work in China had expired. So it was this friend who actually bought Michael Boatwright his ticket back to the States. Michael went to Palm Springs in the hopes that he might get a job as a tennis instructor. But that plan hadn't worked out. It appeared he had attempted to take his own life again. Only this time when he woke up, Michael didn't exist. He was Yona E. And that was that. After those 5 months in the hospital, it seemed like it was time for Michael to move on. So he was relocated to a homeless shelter in Riverside County, which is a couple of hours outside of LA. Someone at the Riverside County Department of Mental Health had an idea. Instead of trying to find him a home here in the United States, why don't we send him back to Sweden, where he belongs? I'm abbreviating this, but they gave him a one-way ticket to Sweden, where he could restart his life or continue his life as Yona E. And it was in Sweden that the puzzle pieces began to come together. And it was revealed that he actually had lived in Sweden decades earlier. There were people who remembered him in a certain part of Sweden, not as Yona E, but they did remember him. And for a while, that seemed the perfect solution. Michael was now Yona, living in Sweden. He'd found his people. He was home. But it appears whatever it was he was trying to forget ultimately caught up with him. 14 months after he was discovered and then relocated to Sweden, Yona was found dead in Sweden. He'd taken his own life. This case of Michael/Yona, this was a pretty extreme set of circumstances. And the outcome was tragic. But back in Baton Rouge, Kim was dealing with a similar set of circumstances because she was struggling. It had been 2 months since she experienced this memory loss. 2 months of waiting. And this time when she went to see her doctors, the ones who told her that time would likely heal all wounds, she wondered, when was all of this going to make sense? Her doctors told her that if her memory hadn't come back and it had now been 2 months, it was likely never to come back. Maybe bits and pieces. This state of being forever 17, it could be itself a forever condition. And those doctors were apparently right. In the years since that happened, she hasn't regained her memory. At least according to the interview she did a couple of years ago. And she didn't have the option of moving to Sweden and starting a new life or traveling back in time to be in high school again. She had to force herself to live in the here and now. And that meant learning how to do some pretty big things. She learned how to love the life that she had. For most of her life, Kim kept a journal. And when Kim sat down, the one who had no memory of these past decades, this journal seemed like it would afford her an opportunity to figure out who she was and what happened. In the process of that, she saw she had a lot of good times. But she saw she had some bad times, too. So Kim made a decision. Any memories that she didn't like, stories that were in her journal that had happened to her, though it didn't feel like they happened to her, she just ripped them out, threw them away. Because there was one good side to all of this. That she could reimagine her past. Her friends and family told her the best things about her. In a way, she tried to treat this like she had gotten a new lease on life. That there were some dark times that she didn't need to dwell on ever again. And even though she was indeed pushing 60, she decided to keep the optimism she had at 17. 364 days of the year, Kim is all about new memories. But there's one day a year where she's allowed to travel back in time, where she's free to be 17 again. It's now a tradition in her family that they celebrate Christmas like it's 1979. From the silver tinsel to her mother's decorations, kept in the original box. These once sentimental objects were now priceless artifacts, a connection to her past life that she'll never forget. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. We'll be back next week with an all-new True Crime for Bedtime story. Until then, nighty-night.